On August 3, 1923, Vice President Calvin Coolidge became the 30th President of the United States upon the sudden death of his predecessor, Warren G. Harding. His father, Colonel John Coolidge, a notary public and justice of the peace, administered the oath of office at 2:47 a.m. in the sitting room of the family home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Headlines announced the news the following day, and Americans everywhere wondered, who is Calvin Coolidge? He was born on the 4th of July, 1872, and is the only United States president whose birthday is on Independence Day. He began his education in the Vermont public school system and attended Amherst College in Massachusetts, where he studied English, Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. A diplomat once said that Silent Cal could speak 5 languages and be silent in every one of them. After graduation, he read the law with the Northampton, Massachusetts firm of Hammond and Field, and passed the state bar exam in 1897. His 30-year political career began in 1898 as Northampton City Councilman and went on to serve as city solicitor, city Republican chairman, and clerk of the courts for Hampshire County. He was elected mayor in 1909 and re-elected the following year. Mr. Coolidge was a member of the Massachusetts General Assembly for 2 years prior to his election to the Senate in 1911. There he served as Senate President during his last 2 terms. After 3 years as Lieutenant Governor, Mr. Coolidge was elected governor in 1918 and again in 1919. While he gained a national reputation as a man of law and order for his role during the Boston police strike, his most significant achievement was consolidating 118 different state departments into just 18. The legacy of the Coolidge Presidency from 1923 to 1929 is characterized by his personal attributes of integrity and frugality. Under his leadership, the economy flourished. The national debt declined from $22.3 billion to $16.9 billion. The federal budget was reduced from $5.1 billion to $3.3 billion. By 1927, 98% of the population paid no income tax. His foreign policy favored U.S. participation in the World Court. A war with Mexico was averted, and amicable relations were restored. In 1928, he signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, an international peace treaty in which participating nations promised not to use war to resolve disputes. His civil rights record is largely forgotten. He signed legislation making Native Americans U.S. citizens. He proposed an anti-lynching law and funding for a National Museum of African American History. And he opposed Japanese exclusion in the Immigration Act of 1924. Perhaps his lasting legacy is not his legislative record, but his personal record of leadership with dignity and humility. In his own words, he once observed, "It is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know he is not a great man."
The 1919 Boston police strike has had an impact on Bostonians and Americans that has lasted for generations. To appreciate its place in history, it's important to understand the timeline of events that led up to the crisis. By the end of 1918, the Great War was over. The Spanish flu epidemic had run its course, and Massachusetts voters elected Calvin Coolidge as their 48th governor. Let's turn the clock back to 1919 to review the headline stories for that year, as reported in the Boston Herald. On January 6th, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep at his home in Oyster Bay, New York. The 26th President of the United States and former New York City Police Commissioner was only 60 years old. In his tribute, Governor Coolidge stated, "He appealed to the imagination of youth and satisfied the judgment of maturity." On January 15th, a 2-million-gallon storage tank burst, sending a wave of molasses throughout the north end of Boston, killing 21 people and injuring 150 more victims. Though sabotage was suspected, a lengthy investigation determined the cause was due to faulty construction. The following day, Nebraska became the 36th and deciding state to approve the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. On January 26th, a Boston theater advertisement announced an evening of slapstick comedy with the first vaudeville appearance of the famous Keystone Cops. On February 6th, 60,000 Seattle workers declared a general strike that lasted 5 days. There was no violence, and not a single arrest was made. The strikers relented when Mayor Ole Hansen summoned federal troops. He was hailed by the press as the man of the hour, becoming a national hero overnight. On April 15th, 20,000 operators, led by the Boston Local Telephone Workers Union, shut down service in New England. The women, earning $16 a week, demanded $22 and, after a week of negotiations, settled for $19 a week. On the 1st of May, Socialist Party members organized parades across the nation in support of the labor movement that resulted in riots, including in Boston. Local headlines reported, "Hundreds beaten in Roxbury. May Day parade ends with 114 under arrest." In retaliation, a series of mail bombs was sent the following month to high-ranking officials, including U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. The explosion detonated outside of his home in Washington, D.C., shattering the windows of his neighbors, including the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On June 4th, the United States Senate adopted the suffrage amendment that, upon ratification by a majority of the states, would give women the right to vote. Among its early advocates was an aspiring politician from western Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge. On June 25th, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Versailles Peace Treaty that officially ended the First World War. The 26th Yankee Division, headquartered in Boston, had been the first of the American expeditionary forces to be organized, the first to arrive in Europe, and the first to prepare for battle. On September 22nd, American steelworkers went on strike, urged on by 82-year-old labor activist Mother Jones, known as the most dangerous woman in America. After clashing with local law enforcement for nearly 4 months, the workers accepted their fate. Public sentiment had turned against them, and advances in technology made most of the skilled jobs obsolete. On October 2nd, the morning headlines reported that President Wilson was seriously ill. He had suffered a severe stroke that left him incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. On October 18th, the Cincinnati Reds won the World Series by beating the Chicago White Sox 10-5. Or did they? Less than a year later, 2 Chicago players confessed to rigging the games. After the grand jury returned its indictments, Chicago Daily News reporter Charlie Owens summed up the Black Sox scandal. His infamous headline, directed at outfielder shoeless Joe Jackson, read, "Say it ain't so, Joe." On November 10th, the American Federation of Labor endorsed the United Mine Workers coal strike. Meanwhile, the newly organized American Legion held its first national convention in Minneapolis, Minnesota. By year's end, 1 million veterans were enrolled as members. 1919 turned out to be a year of growing unrest among American workers, resulting in protests, strikes, and escalating violence. Christmas came to an abrupt end in New England the following day when baseball fans learned the shocking news that Red Sox sell Babe Ruth to Yanks for more than $100,000. And so began the curse of the Bambino. Years later, during his short-lived retirement, President Calvin Coolidge wrote his autobiography. Looking back on his life, he reflected upon his 2 terms as governor of Massachusetts and the dramatic events of 1919. In his own words, Mr. Coolidge clearly recognized the role that fate had played. No doubt it was the police strike of Boston that brought me into national prominence.
No doubt it was the Boston police strike that brought me into national prominence. That furnished the occasion, and I took advantage of the opportunity. I was ready to meet the emergency. Just what lay behind that event, I was never able to learn. Sometimes I have mistrusted that it was a design to injure me politically. If so, it was only to recoil upon the perpetrators, for it increased my political power many-fold. Still, there was a day or two when the event hung in the balance, when the police commissioner of Boston, Edwin U. Curtis, was apparently cast aside and discredited, and my efforts to give him any support indicated my own undoing. But I soon had him reinstated, and there was a strong expression of public opinion in our favor. I've often said, if you see 10 troubles coming down the road, you can be sure that 9 of them will run into a ditch before they reach you. The Boston police strike was one of those troubles that kept coming down the road. In preparing my autobiography, I've reflected upon the events that led up to this crisis and considered what, if anything, I might have done differently to have averted it. This story is one that can and should be told from multiple perspectives. Journalists and historians, political, business, and religious leaders, average citizens, and of course, the police officers and the families themselves. My present objective is to simply contribute my own point of view. There are 3 main characters in my version of the 1919 Boston police strike with whom I interacted most closely. The police commissioner, Mr. Edwin U. Curtis, the mayor, Mr. Andrew J. Peters, and the founder and president of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, Mr. Samuel Gompers. Ordinarily, the governor of Massachusetts has little to do with the day-to-day operations of the Boston Police Department. Since 1906, that has been the responsibility of the police commissioner, a position that replaced a 3-person board that the legislature deemed unwieldy and inefficient. The appointment is for a 5-year term and is named by the governor. However, no increases in salaries can be given the police department except by the concurrent action of the police commissioner and the mayor. Many have speculated that the Boston police strike would never have happened had it not been for the untimely death of the city's first police commissioner, Mr. Stephen O'Mara. He died of a stroke on December 15, 1918. During the course of his 12-year career, he earned the respect of his men who, through his leadership, truly became Boston's finest. Likewise, many have speculated that the Boston police strike was inevitable under the leadership of Commissioner O'Mara's successor, Edwin Upton Curtis, who was appointed by my predecessor, the outgoing governor. Mr. Curtis was an attorney who had served one term as mayor of Boston and, more recently, served as a member of the Metropolitan Park Commission. Whereas Mr. O'Mara was of Irish descent, Mr. Curtis came from one of Boston's oldest families. Ironically, Mr. Curtis, too, would die in office just 3 years after the strike at the age of 60. He suffered from a heart condition for some time, although he attempted to conceal it. Rumors that members of the police department were discussing the advisability of organizing a union to be affiliated with the American Federation of Labor had been circulating for some time. Consequently, Commissioner O'Mara notified the governor, who then issued General Order Number 129 on July 18, 1918. It stated that, unlike a union of public employees, the police department exists for the impartial enforcement of the laws and the protection of persons and property under all conditions. Should its members incur obligations to an outside organization, they would justly be suspected of abandoning the impartial attitude which heretofore has vindicated their good faith as against the complaints almost invariably made by both sides in many controversies. The general order went on to speculate that if, unfortunately, such a question were to ever arise, I trust that it will be answered with an emphatic refusal by the members of the force who have an intelligent regard for their own self-respect, the credit of the department, and the obligations of the whole public which they undertook with their oath of office. On December 26, 1918, Mr. Curtis and Boston City Mayor Andrew James Peters met with a delegation from the Boston Social Club, an organization that served as a means for members of the Boston Police Department to voice their concerns. The patrolmen reiterated their three long-standing grievances: length of working shifts, working conditions, and, most of all, wages. That summer, they had unsuccessfully petitioned for a $200 increase in the patrolman's annual salary, which was then $1,200. This proposed increase was roughly equivalent to the costs for their uniform and equipment, which policemen were required to purchase themselves. Furthermore, patrolmen worked in excess of 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, with just 1 day off in 15. Their final point of contention related to the conditions under which they were required to work, particularly in the crowded decay and disrepair of the police stations. No doubt, their growing dissent was stirred up by the high wages factories and shipyards were now paying for comparatively unskilled labor. Once again, Mayor Peters refused their request, stating the city could not afford such a hike. Later that week, the Boston Herald headline read, "Asks police to be patient. Curtis says that dissatisfied officers may resign." I was inaugurated as the 48th governor of Massachusetts on January 2nd, 1919. The following day, my wife, Grace Goodhue Coolidge, would celebrate her 40th birthday as the First Lady of the Commonwealth. A man who has the companionship of a lovely and gracious woman has the supreme blessing that life can give. And no citizen of the United States understands that statement better than do I. In my inaugural address, I dwelt on the need of promoting the public health, education, and the opportunity for employment at fair wages in accordance with the right of the people to be well-born, well-reared, well-educated, well-employed, and well-paid. Each individual must have the rewards and opportunities worthy of the character of our citizenship, a broader recognition of his worth, and a larger liberty, protected by order and always under the law. Such results cannot be secured at once, but they should be ever before us. I also stressed the necessity of keeping government expenses as low as possible, assisting in every possible way the reestablishing of our returning veterans, and reorganizing the numerous state departments in accordance with a recent change of the Constitution that limited their number to 20. There being no executive mansion, the governor has no special social duties, so I kept my quarters at the Adams House, as I always had lived there when in Boston, where Mrs. Coolidge came sometimes. But as our boys needed her, she stayed for the most part in Northampton. She had never taken any part in my political life, but had given her attention to our home. It was not until we went to Washington that she came into public prominence and favor. In February, President Wilson landed in Boston on his return from France and spoke at a large meeting where I made a short address of welcome, pledging him my support and in helping settle the remaining war problems. Then I began a friendly personal relation with him and Mrs. Wilson, which has always continued. Our servicemen were constantly returning and had to be aided in getting back into private employment. About $20 million was paid them out of the state treasury. In the confusion attendant to the end of the war, the work of the legislation dragged on throughout the spring and well into the summer. On Friday, April 11th, I greeted my old friend Brigadier General Fightin' Bearcat Sherburne and the doughboys of the Yankee Division who returned to Boston aboard the troop ship Mongolia. That Sunday, my family and I celebrated Calvin Jr.'s 11th birthday. It is a memory that I cherish because in just 5 years, he had died. ways of providence are often beyond our understanding. Perhaps if I had not been president, he would not have raised a blister on his toe, which resulted in blood poisoning, playing lawn tennis on the south grounds of the White House. When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. Commissioner Curtis and Mayor Peters were finally able to grant the police force their $200 raise in May 1919. However, by that time, soaring high costs of living eroded buying power, so that even with that raise, policemen were still having difficulty making ends meet. Personally, I could not blame them for feeling as they do when they get less than a streetcar conductor. Ironically, the General Court took up the matter of salary increases that same month, but it was not in consideration of the police force's wages. This injustice was very much on my mind when the legislature sent me House Bill number 1629, a measure to increase the annual salaries of the members of the General Court from $1,000 to $1,500. The proposed 50% increase was to be raised retroactively. While I did not veto many bills which were passed, I rejected this one. In my response, I pointed out to the General Court that the addition of $142,000 to the expense of the Commonwealth in perpetuity is not to be undertaken but upon proven necessity. It would be futile to discuss whether their services are worth more or less than this, as that is not here the question. Membership in the General Court is not a job. They are services rendered to the Commonwealth by senators and representatives that are priceless. For the searching out of great principles on which legislation is based, there is no adequate compensation. If value for services were the criterion, there would be 280 different salaries. When membership is sought as a means of livelihood, legislation will pass from a public function to a private enterprise. Men do not serve here for pay. They seek work in places of responsibility and find that in that seeking, not their pay, their honor. No person was ever honored for what he received. He's honored for what he gave. In the end, my objection was not sustained. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, held its 39th annual convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, during June. Under the leadership of its president, Samuel Gompers, delegates condemned radicalism and voted against recognizing the Soviet Union. However, they did announce that the organization was now prepared to grant charters to police unions, reversing a long-standing policy. The summer months proved to be a period of growing unrest amongst all workers, not just the members of the Boston Police Department. I returned to my home in Northampton on the 4th day of July in the year of our Lord 1919, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 144th. It was my 47th birthday. My family and I attended a community picnic and welcomed back Northampton servicemen and congratulated all men and women of the state who helped win the war. Later that month, the following news brief appeared under the Boston Herald that read, and I quote, "Boston police wish to join the AFL. Members of the Boston Police Department, whose organization is the Boston Social Club, are circulating petitions for admission to the American Federation of Labor. Petitions are now being signed in each of the 19 police districts, and, it was said early this morning, between 500 and 600 of the 1,600 officers have already attached their signatures." One reason for the movement to join the AFL is said to be the fact that the members of the Chicago police force are about to receive $2,000 a year, while the Boston wage is $1,600. The police of other cities throughout the state are also planning to join the Federation of Labor, it is said. In August, I went to Vermont. On my return, I found that the difficulties in the police department of Boston were growing serious and made a statement to the reporters at the State House that I should support Commissioner Edwin U. Curtis in his decisions concerning their adjustment. I felt he was entitled to every confidence. The trouble arose over the proposal of the policemen who had long been permitted to maintain a local organization of their own to form a union and affiliate with the American Federation of Labor. This was contrary to a long-established rule of the department, which was agreed to by each member when he went onto the force and had the effect of law. When the Policemen's Union persisted in its course, I was urged by a committee appointed by the mayor to interfere and attempt to make Commissioner Curtis settle the dispute by arbitration. The governor appoints the commissioner and probably could remove him, but he has no more jurisdiction over his acts than he has over the judges of the courts. Besides, I did not see how it was possible to arbitrate the question of the authority of the law or the necessity of obedience to the rules of the department and the orders of the commissioner. These principles were the heart of the whole controversy and the only important questions at issue. It can readily be seen how important they were and what effect it might have been had they not been maintained. I decided to support them whatever the consequences might be. I fully expected that it would result in my defeat in the coming campaign for re-election as governor. While I had no direct responsibility for the conduct of police matters in Boston, yet, as the chief executive, it was my general duty to require the laws to be enforced. So, I remained in Boston and kept carefully informed of the conditions. I knew I might be called on to act at any time. The laws of our country have designated the first Monday of each September as Labor Day. I spent that day in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where I participated in a benefit for the local post of the American Legion. In my address, I quoted the founder and president of the American Federation of Labor, Mr. Samuel Gompers, who said, in effect, "America may not be perfect. It has the imperfections of all things human. But it is the best country on earth. And the man who will not work for it, will not fight for it, and if need be die for it, is unworthy to live in it." Building upon that thought, I continued saying, happily, the day when the call to fight or die is now past. But the day when it is the duty of all Americans to work will remain forever. The trained businessman and the humblest workman must each contribute. All of us must work, and in that work there should be no interruption. On Sunday, September 7th, my eldest son John's 13th birthday, I went to Northampton and by motor and remained overnight as I had an engagement to speak before a state convention of the American Federation of Labor at Greenfield Monday morning, which I fulfilled. I left that town at once for Boston, stopping at Fitchburg to call my office to learn if there were any new developments within the Boston Police Department. I reached Boston after 4 o'clock that afternoon and had a conference with some of the representatives of the city. I did not leave Boston again for a long time. When it became perfectly apparent that the policemen's union was acting in violation of the rules of the department, the leaders were brought before the commissioner on charges, tried, and removed from office. Where about 3/4 of the force left the department in a body at about 5 o'clock on the afternoon of Tuesday, September 9th. The number was much larger than had been expected. News of the strike made front-page headlines on all Boston newspapers. Just below it, the Boston Herald ran a related story, and I quote, "Gompers in losing race with death. Aged father dies in Dorchester before labor leader arrives. Was 91 years old and totally blind. As soon as word reached him," the Herald continued, "that his father was dying, he started on the first train from Washington in a futile race to reach the bedside before his father's death." Ironically, Samuel Gompers arrived in Boston just in time to witness the events of the Boston police strike firsthand as they unfolded. 6 years later, I would come to understand just how he felt when I, too, boarded a train from Washington in a futile race to reach the bedside before my own father's death. The Metropolitan Police of more than 100 and the State Police of 30 or 40 men had been kept in readiness and were at once put on duty. The motor corps of the State Guard was held at the Armory, and that night I kept the Attorney General, the Adjutant General, and my secretary at my hotel to be ready to respond to any call for help. As everything was quiet, the motor corps went home. Around midnight, bands of men appeared on the street who broke many shop windows and carried away quantities of goods which were on display. Many arrests were made, but the remaining police and the reinforcements were not sufficient to prevent the disorder. I knew nothing of this until morning. The disorder of Tuesday night was most reprehensible, but it was only an incident. It had little relation to the real issues. I have always felt that I should have called out the State Guard as soon as the police had left their posts. The commissioner did not feel that this was appropriate. Mayor Andrew J. Peters, who was the man of high character and a personal friend, but of the opposite party, had conferred with me. He had the same authority as the governor to call out all the guard in the city of Boston. It would be very unusual for a governor to act except on the request of the local authorities. No disorder yet existed, and it would have been a rather violent assumption that it was threatened, but it could have been made. Such action probably would have saved some property, but would have decided no issue. In fact, it would have made it more difficult to maintain the position Mr. Curtis had taken and which I was supporting, because the issue was not understood. And the disorder focused public attention on it and showed just what it meant to have a police force that did not obey orders. On reaching my office in the morning, it was reported to me that the mayor was calling out the State Guard of Boston to report about 5 o'clock that afternoon. He also requested me to furnish more troops. I supplemented his action by calling substantially the entire State Guard to report at once. They gathered at the armories and were patrolling the streets in a few hours. When they came with their muskets in their hands, with bayonets fixed, there was little more trouble from disorder. It was soon reported to me that the mayor, acting under a special law, had taken charge of the police force of the city and, by putting a guard officer in command, had virtually displaced the commissioner, who came to me in great distress. If he was to be superseded, I thought the men that he had discharged might be taken back and the cause lost. Certainly, they and the rest of the policemen's union must have rejoiced at his discomfort. Thinking I knew what to do, I consulted the law, as is my custom. I found a general statute that gives the governor authority to call any police officer in the state to assist him. I showed this to Attorney General and to ex-Attorney General Herbert Parker, who was advising Mr. Curtis. They thought I was right and consulted a profound judge of law, ex-Attorney General Albert E. Pillsbury, who confirmed their opinions. The strike occurred on Tuesday night. The Guard were called on Wednesday, and Thursday I issued a general order restoring Mr. Curtis to his place as commissioner in order to control the police, and made a proclamation calling on all citizens to assist me in preserving order, and especially directing all police officers in Boston to obey the orders of Mr. Curtis. This was the important contribution that I made to the tactics of the situation, which has never fully been realized. To Mr. Curtis should go the credit for raising the issue and enforcing the principle that the police should not affiliate with any outside body, whether of wage earners or wage payers, but should remain unattached, impartial officers of the law with sole allegiance to the public. In this, I supported him. When rumors of a strike at the powerhouse, which furnished electricity for all Boston, a naval vessel was run up to the station with plenty of electricians on board, ready to go over the side and keep the plant in operation. A wagon train of supplies, arms, and ammunition was brought in from Camp Devens, and all the State Guard mobilized. A statement was made by President Wilson strongly condemning the defection of the police. Volunteer police began to come in, and over $500,000 was raised by popular subscription to meet necessary expenses and caring for the dependents of the Guard, and even for helping the families of some of the police who left their posts. Later, I helped these men in securing other employment, but refused to allow them again to be policemen. Public feeling became very much aroused. While officers of support came from every quarter, the opposition was very active. Soon, Samuel Gompers began to telegraph me asking for the removal of Mr. Curtis and the reinstatement of the Union policemen. This required me to make a reply in which I stated, among other things, that there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anytime, anywhere. This phrase caught the attention of the nation. It was beginning to be clear that if voluntary associations were to be permitted to substitute their will for the authority of public officials, the end of our government was at hand. The issue was nothing less than whether the law which the people had made through their duly authorized agencies should be supreme. This issue I took to the people in my campaign for re-election as governor. Though I was hampered by an attack of influenza and spoke but 3 or 4 times, I was able to make the issue plain even beyond the confines of Massachusetts. Many of the wage earners, both organized and unorganized, who knew I had always treated them fairly, must have supported me, for I won by 125,101 vote. The people decided in favor of the integrity of their own government. President Wilson sent me a telegram of congratulations. I felt at the time that the speeches I made and the statements that I issued had a clearness of thought and revealed a power I had not before been able to express, which confirmed my belief that when a duty comes to us, with it comes a power to enable us to perform it. I was not thinking so much of the governorship, which I already had, as much as the grave danger to the country if the voters did not decide correctly. My faith that the people would respond to the truth was justified. The requirements of the situation as it developed seem clear and plain now and easy to decide, but as they arose, they were very complicated and involved many immaterial issues. The right thing to do never requires subterfuges. It is always simple and direct. That is the reason that intrigue usually falls on its own weight. After the election, I had the work of making appointments in order to reduce the entire state administration to the limit of 20 departments and a special session of the General Court to deal with some street railway problems. So I had little time to think of politics. But soon I learned that many people in the country were thinking of me. The 2 years I served as governor were a time of transition from war to peace. New problems constantly arose. Great confusion prevailed. Nothing was settled, and it was possible only to feel my way from day to day. But there were years of progress, if partly in a negative way. The new position of the wage earners was perfected and solidified. A 48-hour week for women and minors was established by a bill passed by the General Court, which I signed. The budget system went into full effect the first year I was governor and helped keep the state finances in good condition. The departments were reorganized and the street railways given relief. My second year, a bill was passed allowing the sale of beer with a 2.75% alcoholic content, which I vetoed because I thought it was in violation of the Constitution, which I had sworn to defend. The veto was sustained. A constant struggle was going on to keep the costs of living down and the rate of wages up. A state commission was held at the office with increased powers to resist profiteering in the necessaries of life. In the Depression of 1920, some of our banks and manufacturers found themselves in difficulties. All of these things reached the governor in one form or another. But in general, conditions were such that the entire efforts of the people were engaged in easing themselves down. There was little opportunity to direct their attention towards constructive action. They were clearing away the refuse from the great conflagration preparatory to rebuilding on a grander and more pretentious scale. Nothing was natural. Everything was artificial. So much energy had to be expended into keeping the ship of state on a straight course that there was little left to carry it ahead. But when I finished my 2 terms in January 1921, the demobilization of the country was practically complete. People had found themselves again and were ready to undertake the great work of reconstruction in which they have since been so successfully engaged. In that work, we have seen the people of America create a new heaven and a new earth. The old things have passed away, given place to a glory never before experienced by any people of our world.
To learn more about Calvin Coolidge and the 1919 Boston police strike, 3 books in particular address this subject. A City in Terror by Francis Russell, the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge, and Coolidge, a biography by Amity Schlaze.
In the spring of 2017, Tracy Messer, a living history performer from Peterborough, New Hampshire, made his very first appearance as Calvin Coolidge. Perhaps the question people ask him most often is, why did you choose to become the next 30th President of the United States? He'll answer with a smile, I was born to play this role. Tracy was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area, where his maternal grandfather worked for the United States Department of Agriculture, starting with the Coolidge administration. When his mother was a little girl, she joined in the annual Easter celebrations on the White House lawn, where President and Mrs. Coolidge welcomed the children. Meanwhile, his father was born in Boston right about the time Calvin Coolidge was about to become governor of the state of Massachusetts. In fact, Tracy's great-grandfather once lived in the Coolidge's hometown of Northampton, Massachusetts. Tracy's parents and grandparents had great respect and affection for Calvin Coolidge. His dad and grandfathers shared many of the traditional Yankee characteristics for which our 30th president was so well known. Men of few words who spent their time and money wisely, loyal to their families and communities, honest, hard-working, and polite gentlemen who cherished lifelong education and appreciated the beauty of New England in all its seasons. Tracy and his family admired the view of Mount Ascutney from their old farmhouse in New Hampshire, just like Calvin Coolidge did from his own farmhouse in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Perhaps what Tracy loves most about Mr. Coolidge is his common sense and his sense of humor. Tracy was not the first person to portray Calvin Coolidge. His friend and mentor Jim Cook kept President Coolidge's memory alive and well for 30 years until 2015, when he retired that particular cranky Yankee. With encouragement from Jim, the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, and the Coolidge family, Tracy was honored by the invitation to become the next 30th President of the United States. When asked if he was ready for the job, he replied in the words of Calvin Coolidge, "I think I can swing it." To contact Calvin Coolidge living history performer Tracy Messer, visit keepcoolwithcoolidge.net.